How many died in the September 11th attacks?
About 3,000 people died that day as a result of the terrorist attacks on the United States. The strikes on New York's World Trade Center claimed 2,602 lives. And another 125 died at the Pentagon, outside Washington, D.C. The numbers include firefighters and police officers who died as part of the rescue effort. The victims on board the hijacked flights, which were used as terrorist weapons, numbered an additional 87 on American Airlines Flight 11, which crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 60 on United Airlines Flight 175, which crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 59 on American Airlines Flight 77, which slammed into the Pentagon. And 40 on United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed in rural Shanksville, Pennsylvania. In February 2005, officials announced that they had exhausted all possible methods of identifying the human remains recovered at Ground Zero. Of the 2,749 people reported missing at the World Trade Center, positive identification had been made on 1,161 people. The rest were presumed dead. 2,749 death certificates were issued related to the World Trade Center attack.
How many died in the September 11th attacks?
About 3,000 people died that day as a result of the terrorist attacks on the United States. The strikes on New York's World Trade Center claimed 2,602 lives. And another 125 died at the Pentagon, outside Washington, D.C. The numbers include firefighters and police officers who died as part of the rescue effort. The victims on board the hijacked flights, which were used as terrorist weapons, numbered an additional 87 on American Airlines Flight 11, which crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 60 on United Airlines Flight 175, which crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 59 on American Airlines Flight 77, which slammed into the Pentagon. And 40 on United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed in rural Shanksville, Pennsylvania. In February 2005, officials announced that they had exhausted all possible methods of identifying the human remains recovered at Ground Zero. Of the 2,749 people reported missing at the World Trade Center, positive identification had been made on 1,161 people. The rest were presumed dead. 2,749 death certificates were issued related to the World Trade Center attack.
How many were injured in the September 11th attacks?
The exact number of injuries resulting from the attacks is not known. Data from the aftermath show that thousands of people were treated in hospitals after the attacks. Some sustained serious physical injuries such as burns, eye injuries, and respiratory problems. But exact figures on the number and extent of injuries could not be gathered. Partly because some had chosen not to receive medical treatment or had received it later. According to a September 2004 report by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, a multitude of physical and mental health effects have been reported in the years since the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, but the full health impact of the attack is unknown. Concern about potential long-term effects on people affected by the attack remains. The report cites several injury categories including respiratory health, reproductive health, and mental health. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, alone was thought to have affected a great number of New Yorkers, particularly emergency responders and children. According to the report, PTSD is an often debilitating and potentially chronic disorder that can develop after experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event. It includes such symptoms as difficulty sleeping, irritability or anger, detachment or estrangement, poor concentration, distressing dreams, intrusive memories and images, and avoidance of reminders of the trauma. Mental health specialists reported that people across the nation demonstrated symptoms consistent with PTSD after the 9/11 attacks.
How many were injured in the September 11th attacks?
The exact number of injuries resulting from the attacks is not known. Data from the aftermath show that thousands of people were treated in hospitals after the attacks. Some sustained serious physical injuries such as burns, eye injuries, and respiratory problems. But exact figures on the number and extent of injuries could not be gathered. Partly because some had chosen not to receive medical treatment or had received it later. According to a September 2004 report by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, a multitude of physical and mental health effects have been reported in the years since the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, but the full health impact of the attack is unknown. Concern about potential long-term effects on people affected by the attack remains. The report cites several injury categories including respiratory health, reproductive health, and mental health. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, alone was thought to have affected a great number of New Yorkers, particularly emergency responders and children. According to the report, PTSD is an often debilitating and potentially chronic disorder that can develop after experiencing or witnessing a traumatic event. It includes such symptoms as difficulty sleeping, irritability or anger, detachment or estrangement, poor concentration, distressing dreams, intrusive memories and images, and avoidance of reminders of the trauma. Mental health specialists reported that people across the nation demonstrated symptoms consistent with PTSD after the 9/11 attacks.
What was the 9/11's Commission?
It was the 10-member group created by a congressional act signed by the President. On November 27, 2002, the Bipartisan Commission, consisting of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, was chosen by Congress to look into how the attacks of September 11, 2001, could have happened and how such a tragedy could be avoided in the future. During its investigation, the commissioners and their staff reviewed more than 2.5 million pages of documents, interviewed more than 1,200 people in 10 countries, held 19 days of hearings, and took public testimony from 160 witnesses. The Commission wrapped up its work in all due speed, publishing a full report less than 2 years after it received its mandate. The 567-page report chronicles the events of 9/11, looks at the roots and growth of the new terrorism, reviews the U.S. response to the attacks and to previous assaults, including the August 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and recommends changes to prevent further terrorist strikes. The report was made available as a book and an online document, presented to the American people for their consideration. Among the key disclosures in the report were that the Commission found no credible evidence that Iraq and Al-Qaeda cooperated on the attacks against the United States. That finding was immediately dismissed by the White House in June 2004. The Commission also reported that the original plan for the Al-Qaeda attacks on the U.S. homeland included a total of 10 hijacked airplanes, striking targets on the east and west coasts. The plan was dismissed by Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden as too complex. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the U.S.-led retaliatory strikes on Afghanistan, the Commission believed that Al-Qaeda had become more decentralized, with cell leaders assuming greater authority for decision-making.
What was the 9/11's Commission?
It was the 10-member group created by a congressional act signed by the President. On November 27, 2002, the Bipartisan Commission, consisting of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, was chosen by Congress to look into how the attacks of September 11, 2001, could have happened and how such a tragedy could be avoided in the future. During its investigation, the commissioners and their staff reviewed more than 2.5 million pages of documents, interviewed more than 1,200 people in 10 countries, held 19 days of hearings, and took public testimony from 160 witnesses. The Commission wrapped up its work in all due speed, publishing a full report less than 2 years after it received its mandate. The 567-page report chronicles the events of 9/11, looks at the roots and growth of the new terrorism, reviews the U.S. response to the attacks and to previous assaults, including the August 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and recommends changes to prevent further terrorist strikes. The report was made available as a book and an online document, presented to the American people for their consideration. Among the key disclosures in the report were that the Commission found no credible evidence that Iraq and al-Qaeda cooperated on the attacks against the United States. That finding was immediately dismissed by the White House in June 2004. The Commission also reported that the original plan for the al-Qaeda attacks on the U.S. homeland included a total of 10 hijacked airplanes, striking targets on the east and west coasts. The plan was dismissed by al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden as too complex. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the U.S.-led retaliatory strikes on Afghanistan, the Commission believed that al-Qaeda had become more decentralized, with cell leaders assuming greater authority for decision-making.
Finally, how can Rwanda rebuild?
The governing Tutsis have been able to enforce a calm on the tiny landlocked nation. But some believe it is an uneasy calm and wonder how long minority Tutsis can retain control over a country that is 85% Hutu. In Rwanda's efforts to serve justice, its jails and courts remained jammed 10 years after the genocide. And since so many had fled the country and others escaped prosecution, justice could not be served fully. Some legal experts thought that a general amnesty issued by the Rwandan government would help put the nation's problems behind them.
What is the basis of the conflict over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank?
The conflict is rooted in Jewish and Arab claims to the same lands in the Palestine region, which was under British control between 1917 and 1947. The Gaza Strip is a tiny piece of territory along the eastern Mediterranean Sea and adjacent to Egypt. After the Nation of Israel was established and boundaries were determined by the United Nations (UN), in 1947, the Gaza Strip bounded on two sides by the new Israel came under Egyptian control. The Arab-Israeli War of 1967 resulted in Israeli takeover and occupation of Gaza. But unrest continued, and in 1987 and 1988 the region was the site of Arab uprisings known as the Intifada. A historic accord between the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and Israel, signed in May 1994, provided for Palestinian self-rule in the Gaza Strip. This has been in effect since, though peace in the region remains elusive, as extremists on both sides of the conflict stage sporadic acts of violence. The West Bank, which does not neighbor the Gaza Strip, is an area on the east of Israel, along the Jordan River and Dead Sea. The West Bank includes the towns of Jericho, Bethlehem, and Hebron. The Holy City of Jerusalem is situated on the shared border between Israel and the West Bank. by the UN mandate that established the independent Jewish state of Israel in 1948. The West Bank area was supposed to become Palestinian. But Arabs who were unhappy with the UN agreement in the first place attacked Israel. And Israel responded by occupying the West Bank. A 1950 truce brought the West Bank under the control of neighboring Jordan. This situation lasted until 1967, when Israeli forces again occupied the region. Israelis soon began establishing settlements there, which provoked the resentment of Arabs. The Intifada uprisings that began in the Gaza Strip in 1987 soon spread to the West Bank. In 1988 Jordan relinquished its claim to the area. But fighting between the PLO and Israeli troops continued. Peace talks began in 1991, and the agreements that provided for Palestinian self-rule in the Gaza Strip also provided for the gradual return of West Bank lands to Palestinians. The city of Jericho was the first of these lands. In August 2005 Israel began pulling out of the Gaza Strip after 38 years of occupation. Some Israeli settlers resisted Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's call for withdrawal. But Sharon insisted the move was a critical step toward peace and securing Israel's future.
How did the Treaty of Versailles pave the way for World War II?
In the aftermath of World War I, 1914-18, Germany was severely punished. One clause in the Treaty of Versailles even stipulated that Germany take responsibility for causing the war. In addition to its territorial losses, Germany was also made to pay for an Allied military force that would occupy the west bank of the Rhine River, intended to keep Germany in check for the next 15 years. The treaty also limited the size of Germany's military. In 1921 Germany received a bill for reparations. It owed the Allies $33 million. While the post-war German government had been made to sign the Treaty of Versailles under the threat of more fighting from the Allies, the German people nevertheless faulted their leaders for accepting such strident terms. Not only was the German government weakened, but public resentment over the Treaty of Versailles soon developed into a strong nationalist movement led by German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945.
What was the League of Nations?
The League of Nations was the forerunner to the United Nations. It was an international organization established by the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, 1914–18. Since the United States never ratified that treaty, it was not a member. The League was set up to handle disputes among countries and to avoid another major conflict such as the Great War, which is how World War I was referred to until the outbreak of World War II. But the organization proved to be ineffective. It was unable to intervene in such acts of aggression as Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Italy's conquest of Ethiopia. During 1935 to 1936 and occupation of Albania in 1939, and Germany's takeover of Austria in 1938. The League of Nations dissolved itself during World War II, 1939 to 45. Though unsuccessful, the organization did establish a basic model for a permanent international organization.
Was the Madrid commuter train bombing an act of terrorism?
Spanish officials concluded that the March 11, 2004, bombing of packed commuter trains in Madrid was an act of terrorism, likely motivated by Spain's arrest of dozens of Al-Qaeda suspects after the September 11, 2001, attacks on the United States. At least 3 of those arrested in Spain were charged with helping organize the 9/11 attacks. On March 11, 2004, 10 backpacks loaded with dynamite exploded on 4 trains at the height of morning rush hour, killing 191 people and injuring 1,800. In the investigation that followed, officials uncovered other terrorist plots, including suicide bombings and assassinations aimed at interrupting Spain's court system that tries terrorist suspects. The discoveries led officials to conclude that their nation had become a crossroads for Muslim extremists, in part because of Spain's proximity to northern Africa. In April 2004, as authorities closed in on the hideout of the suspected Madrid bombing ringleader, a Tunisian man, and his associates, the suspects blew up their apartment. A total of 62 suspects were arrested in 2004 in association with the train bombing.
Where was the president on September 11?
President George W. Bush, 1946, began the day at a Sarasota, Florida, elementary school, where he was expected to speak on his education program. At 9:00 a.m. he was notified of the first plane crash into the World Trade Center's North Tower. He was preparing to make his planned speech when, a few moments later, he was told of the second crash. After consulting with advisors, he addressed the gathering at 9:30 a.m. saying there had been an apparent terrorist attack on our country. At 9:57 a.m., Air Force One, with the president on board, took off from Florida. By 10 a.m. Bush had ordered the nation's military to high alert status around the world. At 11:40 a.m., the president's plane landed at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. There he remarked to the press, "Make no mistake. The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts." Shortly after 1 p.m., Air Force One departed Louisiana and headed to Nebraska's Offutt Air Force Base. Throughout the day the president was in contact with his top advisors, including Vice President Dick Cheney, 1941, who was reported to be in a secure location in Washington, D.C. At 4:36 p.m. the president's plane took off from Offutt to make the trip back to Washington. Bush arrived at the White House aboard presidential helicopter Marine One after Air Force One made an escorted landing at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. First Lady Laura Bush, 1946, arrived back at the White House separately via motorcade. She, too, was reportedly in a secure location throughout the day. At 8:30 p.m. the president addressed the nation via a televised broadcast from the Oval Office. In part he said, thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. He went on to say, terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. Further, he promised that the search was underway for those responsible. And he said the nation would stand with its friends and allies to win the war against terrorism. He ended his day with a national security meeting, which lasted nearly 2 hours.
What is the roadmap for peace?
It is a plan for lasting peace in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The roadmap was announced by the Bush administration on March 14, 2003, after several months of working with Russian, European Union, and United Nations, UN officials to develop the plan, which calls for a permanent two-state solution. The roadmap outlines specific, actionable steps to be taken by each side in the conflict. The U.S. State Department described it as a performance-based and goal-driven roadmap, with clear phases, timelines, target dates, and benchmarks aiming at progress through reciprocal steps by the two parties in the political, security, economic, humanitarian, and institution-building fields. In announcing the roadmap, President George W. Bush, 1946, called for an end to the recent wave of violence, Intifada, in the Middle East. For authoritative Palestinian leadership, and for Israeli readiness to comply. He asked for Israeli and Palestinian leaders to contribute to and discuss the roadmap. And he repeated his call for all parties in the Middle East to abandon old hatreds and to meet their responsibilities for peace. The plan, the last phase of which was to have been completed in 2004-05. Foundered amid the daily violence of the Second Intifada, but was given new promise in May 2005 when Palestinian and Israeli leaders met in Egypt to discuss peace.
What was Nazism?
Short for National Socialism, Nazi was a derisive abbreviation that held. The Nazi doctrine rests on three philosophies: extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism. As one of the Central Powers, Germany's defeat in World War I, 1914–18, resulted in severe punishment of that country and its seriously diminished role in Europe. The doctrines of Nazism took hold there, appealing to the masses with promises of a rebuilt Germany. The Bible of Nazism was Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, My Struggle, 1923, which asserted the superiority of a pure Aryan race. Aryans are non-Jewish Caucasians, particularly those of Northern European descent. Led by an infallible ruler, called the Führer, the re-establishment of a German empire, the Third Reich, and the systematic annihilation of people who Nazis perceived to be Germany's worst enemies, Jews and Communists. Nazis ruled Germany from 1933. When Hitler rose to power as head of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In their own country, they enforced their policies through a secret police. The Gestapo, stormtroops, called the SS, and Hitler's bodyguard, called the SA. Elsewhere in Europe, the Nazis used sheer force in imposing their system. Their aggression and ruthlessness resulted in World War II, 1939–45. During the Holocaust, 1933–45, Nazi soldiers, led by Hitler's henchmen, persecuted and exterminated upwards of 12 million people, at least half of whom were European Jews. Nazism ended in 1945, when Hitler killed himself and Germany lost the war. The doctrine, which demonstrated how detrimentally powerful a theory can be, was outlawed thereafter. Sadly, the late 20th century saw a resurgence of neo-Nazism among extremists in Germany and the United States.
How old is guerrilla warfare?
Guerrilla warfare dates back to ancient times but got its name during the Peninsular War of 1809 to 1814 when Napoleon Bonaparte 1769 to 1821 fought for control of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. In Spanish, guerrilla means small war. The resistance to Napoleon's troops employed tactics that are typical of what we know as guerrilla warfare, fighting in small bands, ambushes, sudden raids, and sabotage. It is Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong, 1893–1976, who, in his 22-year fight against the Chinese nationalists, from 1927 to 1949, is believed to have developed the techniques of modern guerrilla warfare. Chairman Mao slowly but surely gained the support and sympathy of the common people, in particular those living in rural areas. Eventually, he had control of the masses who believed the reforms he would make once in office would be favorable to them. The people would provide the manpower and supplies that would sustain the fight. If any followers faulted in their loyalty to the cause, they would be punished. Today, guerrillas rely on terrorist attacks against governments, goading the military into action, which, in turn, rallies the public in its outrage against government. In this way, guerrilla movements can gain popular support over time. Such movements are by no means limited to the countryside. Urban attacks include tactics such as kidnapping and assassination. Such guerrilla measures have led to the outbreak of civil wars.
What was Lend-Lease?
Lend-Lease was a plan, developed and strongly supported by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, to extend material assistance to the Allied powers fighting the Axis powers in World War II. 1939 to 45, in the days preceding U.S. involvement in the war. Roosevelt argued that it was imperative for the country to come to the aid of those fighting Germany and Italy. It was similar to helping your neighbor put out a fire in his house in order to prevent your own house from catching fire and burning. Under Lend-Lease, which was passed by Congress on March 11, 1941, approximately $50 billion of aid in the form of food and supplies, weapons, machinery, and other equipment was provided to the Allied nations, primarily to Britain and the Commonwealth nations first, but later to all nations fighting against Hitler's war machine. The return of the goods was not addressed until after the war had ended. At that time, most people felt the Allies had all contributed everything they had to the war effort, and that the sacrifices made by Allied Europe in the days prior to U.S. entry into the fighting were balanced by the contributions made under the Lend-Lease Act.
What was the Sino-Japanese War?
This dispute between China and Japan, who had not that long ago clashed in the Chinese-Japanese War of 1894–95, began in 1937 and was absorbed by World War II, 1939–45. The trouble between the Asian powers began when Japan, having already taken Manchuria and the Jahal province from China, attacked China again. Though China was in the midst of internal conflict with the nationalist forces of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. 1887–1975, fighting the Communists under Mao Zedong. 1893–1976, China turned its attention to fighting the foreign aggressor. The fighting between the two countries continued into 1941 before war was officially declared by China. In so doing, China was at war not only with the Japanese, but with Japan's Axis allies Germany and Italy as well. The conflict then became part of World War II, which ended with the surrender of Japan to the Allies in September 1945.
Why did so many Americans protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War?
The Vietnam War, 1954–75, divided the American public. The anti-war movement maintained that the conflict in Southeast Asia did not pose a risk to U.S. security, contrary to the domino effect that Washington, D.C. foresaw. And in the absence of a threat to national security, protesters wondered, what are we fighting for? Meanwhile, President Lyndon B. Johnson, 1908 to 1973, slowly stepped up the number of troops sent to Vietnam. Many never came home, and those who did came home changed. Mass protests were held, including the hallmark of the era, the sit-in. Protesters accused the U.S. government of not only involving Americans in a conflict in which the country had no part, but of supporting a corrupt, unpopular and undemocratic government in South Vietnam. Those Americans who supported the nation's fight against communism eventually became frustrated by the United States' inability to achieve a decisive victory in Vietnam. Even for the so-called hawks, who supported the war. The mounting costs of the war hit home when President Johnson requested new taxes. As the casualty count soared, public approval of U.S. participation in Vietnam dropped. By the end of the 1960s, under increasing public pressure, the government began to withdraw American troops from Vietnam. The evacuation of the ground troops was not complete until 1973. But even then, soldiers who were missing in action, MIAs, and prisoners of war, POWs, were left behind.
Who was Generalissimo Franco?
Generalissimo Francisco Franco, 1892 to 1975, was the fascist leader of Spain from 1939 until 1973. He rose to power in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 39, as he led a rebel nationalist army against the loyalist forces. Capturing Madrid in 1939, Franco assumed the role of head of government. Though he and the nationalists had received considerable help from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy to win the Civil War, when fighting broke out in World War II. 1939 to 45, Spain stayed neutral, at least nominally so. In 1947, with the fighting in Europe over, Franco declared himself monarch of Spain and ruled as an authoritative dictator. 2 years before he died, he stepped down as head of state. Though he retained the title Generalissimo, meaning commander-in-chief, Franco named as his successor Prince Juan Carlos, 1938. When Franco died in 1975, Juan Carlos I became the first Spanish monarch to control Spain since his grandfather, King Alfonso XIII, 1886 to 1941, was deposed in 1931 to make way for the brief republic, which was later overthrown by Franco and the nationalists. King Juan Carlos played an important role in transforming Spain into a modern democracy.
What was the Munich Pact?
It was a failed effort to appease the territory and power-hungry German leader Adolf Hitler. 1889 to 1945, in the days leading up to World War II, 1939 to 45. After Germany annexed neighboring Austria in the Anschluss of March 1938, it became known that Hitler had designs on the Sudetenland, a heavily German region of Czechoslovakia. With World War I, 1914-18, a fresh memory, and European nations still recovering from heavy losses, Europe's powers were eager to avoid another conflict. On September 29 and 30, 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler in Munich. They were joined by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, a German ally, and French Premier Édouard Daladier, a Czech ally. Czechoslovakia did not have any representatives at the conference. The leaders quickly worked out a plan for Germany to occupy the Sudetenland. Chamberlain considered Czechoslovakia's concession a reasonable price to pay for peace on the continent. But the effort to assuage Hitler was not successful. In March 1939, Germany moved to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia. On September 1, Germany marched into Poland, and World War II began.
What was the Chiapas Uprising?
Also called the Zapatista Uprising. It was a January 1994 revolt staged by Mayan rebels in Chiapas, Mexico's southernmost state. On New Year's Day, members of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, AZLN, launched a coordinated attack on 4 municipal capitals and a Mexican army headquarters in the remote region. With the cry of Tierra y Libertad, Land and Liberty, the armed insurgents invoked the name and spirit of Emiliano Zapata. 1879 to 1919, Mexico's early 20th century revolutionary leader. The EZLN, or Zapatistas, destroyed government offices, burned land deeds, and freed prisoners. At least 135 people died in the rebellion. On January 12, after 11 days of heavy fighting, a ceasefire was called. The next month peace talks began between EZLN representatives and the Mexican government. Negotiations between the two sides proved to be a frustrating and lengthy process. Seeking democracy, liberty, and justice for all Mexicans, the EZLN called for government reforms, including local autonomy, as well as land redistribution and other measures to aid the region's impoverished indigenous population. In February 1996, the two sides signed the San Andrés Accords and agreed to more talks. But in August of that year, the dialogue stalled. The EZLN said it would not return to the negotiating table until the government implemented the San Andrés Accords. Meanwhile, pro-government paramilitary groups with ties to Mexico's ruling PRI party, Institutional Revolutionary Party, made their presence known in Chiapas. There were violent episodes, the most horrific of which occurred on December 23, 1997, when the pro-government paramilitary group Paz y Justicia, Peace and Justice, brutally attacked a group of unarmed indigenous people in the village of Octeal. A total of 45 people, mostly women and children, were slaughtered, and 25 more were injured. The turbulence in Chiapas is fueled by deep-seated anti-government feelings among the indigenous, Mayan, population. Despite the fact that it is rich in natural resources, including coffee, corn, timber, and oil. It is one of the poorest regions of Latin America. The wealth of Chiapas rests in the hands of a few. In 1990, half of the population in the state was malnourished, 42% had no access to clean water. 33% was without electricity, and 62% did not have a grade school education. It was no coincidence that the 1994 uprising took place the same day that the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, went into effect, according to one Zapatista leader. NAFTA was the death sentence for Mexico's poor farmers, who would now have to compete with farmers north of the border. In 2005, more than 10 years after the Zapatistas burst onto the scene, the situation in Chiapas remained unresolved.
What is the Intifada?
Intifada means uprising in Arabic and refers specifically to two recent periods of intense and regular violence between Palestinians and Israelis in the disputed territories of the Middle East. The First Intifada began in 1987 and did not subside until a peace settlement was brokered between the two sides in Oslo, Norway, in 1993. The Second Intifada began in September 2000. The violence of that uprising continued into 2005 despite ceasefire vows from Arab, Palestinian and Israeli leaders. The second wave of violence was marked by almost daily suicide bombings of Israeli targets, including markets, restaurants, buses, and other public places. Israelis view the intifadas as acts of terrorism, claiming the lives of thousands of Israeli citizens. Palestinians in general and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and the militant Islamic group Hamas in particular consider the tactics part of their war of national liberation, a decades-long struggle to establish an autonomous Palestinian homeland in Israel. In the waves of violence, casualties were high on both sides. More than 4,000 died in the Second Intifada alone. The cycle of conflict appeared endless. Palestinian acts of violence were met with retaliation from the Israelis, which incited further violence from the Palestinians. Hopes for a lasting peace were raised again in February 2005 when Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, 1935, and Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, 1928, held a summit meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. They declared a ceasefire agreement and their intentions to resume negotiations, as outlined in the Roadmap for Peace. But the militant Palestinian group Hamas immediately claimed the verbal agreement was non-binding. Indeed, Hamas, which was largely responsible for the Intifada. Posed major roadblocks to an end of violence in the region. Before they would put down arms, the group demanded total Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, as well as the right of return of Palestinian refugees. Hamas was also dissatisfied with Israel's agreement to release only 900 of the 8,000 Palestinians held prisoner by Israel.
What caused the Spanish Civil War?
From 1936 to 1939, two sides fought for control of Spain, the nationalists and the loyalists. The insurgent nationalists were aristocrats, military leaders, Roman Catholic clergy, and members of a political group called the Phalange Party. They were supported by Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler 1889 to 1945. And Fascist Italy, under Benito Mussolini 1883 to 1945, in their effort to wrest control. The Loyalists were liberals, socialists, and communists. They were supported by the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin 1879 to 1953. A number of non-Spanish idealists, who believed saving the Republic from the fascist rebels was worth dying for, joined the ranks of the Loyalists to form the International Brigade. In his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, Ernest Hemingway 1899 to 1961, who had covered the war as a correspondent, wrote about one young American man who took up arms in behalf of the Loyalist effort. The Nationalists, under Generalissimo Francisco Franco, 1892 to 1975, won the war when they captured Madrid in March 1939, beginning an era of harsh right-wing rule. And, as with any war, the fascist victory had come at a dear price. Hundreds of thousands dead and massive destruction throughout the country.
What was the Nanking Massacre?
One of the most brutal chapters in modern history, the Nanking Massacre, also called the Rape of Nanking, was a mass execution of hundreds of thousands of unarmed Chinese civilians by invading Japanese soldiers in December 1937 and January 1938. No one knows for certain how many people were murdered in the mass killings, but most estimates place the number at 300,000, with another 80,000 people raped and tortured, including women and children. On December 13, 1937, the Japanese Royal Army swept into the eastern Chinese city of Nanking, today called Nanjing, which was then the capital of China. In the weeks that followed, the Japanese soldiers went on an orgy of violence. The atrocities were documented on film by the Japanese themselves as well as by helpless foreigners in the city at the time of the seizure. Surviving photos show unimaginable cruelties. It is believed that Japan's military had been trained to carry out the killings and atrocities in order to make an example of Nanking to other Chinese people, thereby facilitating Japan's intended occupation. The horrific event was the source of recent controversy stirred by the 1997 publication of The Rape of Nanking. The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II by Iris Chang. 1968, a historian and journalist whose grandparents narrowly escaped the massacre. Unlike Germany, which accepted responsibility for the Holocaust of Jews during World War II. 1939–45, and whose Nazi leaders were tried in number at Nuremberg. Japan never acknowledged its crimes committed at Nanking. After World War II, only a few of Japan's military leaders were tried and found guilty of war crimes related to the taking of Nanking. This chapter in Japan's national history has been largely denied by its officials, some of whom accused Chang of issuing propaganda. Chang stood by her research, which included interviews with survivors, as well as with Japanese soldiers who participated in the violence. The massacre remains a deeply divisive event between the two nations and their people.
What was the 9/11's Commission?
It was the 10-member group created by a congressional act signed by the President. On November 27, 2002, the bipartisan commission, consisting of 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, was chosen by Congress to look into how the attacks of September 11, 2001, could have happened and how such a tragedy could be avoided in the future. During its investigation, the commissioners and their staff reviewed more than 2.5 million pages of documents, interviewed more than 1,200 people in 10 countries, held 19 days of hearings, and took public testimony from 160 witnesses. The Commission wrapped up its work in all due speed, publishing a full report less than 2 years after it received its mandate. The 567-page report chronicles the events of 9/11, looks at the roots and growth of the new terrorism, reviews the U.S. response to the attacks and to previous assaults, including the August 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, and recommends changes to prevent further terrorist strikes. The report was made available as a book and an online document, presented to the American people for their consideration. Among the key disclosures in the report were that the Commission found no credible evidence that Iraq and Al-Qaeda cooperated on the attacks against the United States. That finding was immediately dismissed by the White House in June 2004. The Commission also reported that the original plan for the Al-Qaeda attacks on the U.S. homeland included a total of 10 hijacked airplanes, striking targets on the east and west coasts. The plan was dismissed by Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden as too complex. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the U.S.-led retaliatory strikes on Afghanistan, the Commission believed that Al-Qaeda had become more decentralized, with cell leaders assuming greater authority for decision-making.
What was the chronology of events on September 11, 2001?
The sequence of events related to the terrorist attacks on September 11 were as follows. All times are Eastern Daylight Time 8:46 a.m. A passenger plane crashes into the North Tower of New York City's World Trade Center. At first it is assumed to be an accident. But within hours, it is learned that the plane was American Airlines Flight 11, and commandeered by hijackers shortly after takeoff from Boston headed to Los Angeles. It carried 81 passengers, including 5 hijackers, and 11 crew members. 9:03 a.m. A second passenger plane slams into the South Tower of the World Trade Center and explodes. United Airlines later announces that this was Flight 175, another Boston-Los Angeles plane. It carried 56 passengers, including 5 hijackers, and 9 crew members. Both towers of the World Trade Center are in flames. 9:21 a.m. Bridges and tunnels leading into New York City are closed. Within the hour, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, 1944, orders an evacuation of Manhattan south of Canal Street. 9:25 a.m. All flights in the United States are grounded. It is the first time in history that the Federal Airlines Administration, FAA, halts all flights. 9:30 a.m. President George W. Bush, 1946, scheduled to speak at a grade school in Sarasota, Florida, remarks that the nation has been the target of an apparent terrorist attack. 9:45 a.m. A third passenger plane crashes into the east wall of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The plane was American Airlines Flight 77, carrying 58 passengers, including 5 hijackers and 6 crew members. It originated at Washington, D.C.'s Dulles International Airport and was headed to Los Angeles. After being hijacked, the plane made a U-turn over the Ohio-Kentucky border to return to the Washington, D.C. area, where it hit its intended target. 9:45 a.m. The White House is evacuated. 10:05 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. 10:10 a.m. A large section of the Pentagon collapses. 10:10 a.m., a fourth passenger plane crashes in a field in Somerset County, in southwestern Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. It was United Airlines Flight 93, originating in Newark, New Jersey, and bound for San Francisco. After being hijacked, the plane made a U-turn over Ohio and was headed for a target in Washington, D.C., later thought to be Camp David, the White House, or the U.S. Capitol building. After learning via cell phones of the other hijackings, a group of passengers stormed the cockpit in an effort to take the plane, which crashed in the countryside. The plane carried 37 passengers, including 4 hijackers, and a crew of 7. There were no survivors. 10:24 a.m. The FAA reports that it has diverted all incoming transatlantic flights to Canada. 10:28 a.m. The North Tower of the World Trade Center falls. The collapse of each tower blankets lower Manhattan in smoke and ash, turning the brilliantly sunny day to darkness. 10:45 a.m., all federal office buildings in the nation's capital are evacuated. 2 p.m. Senior FBI sources reveal to the media that they are working under the assumption that the 4 airplanes that crashed were part of a terrorist attack. The FBI later learns the identities of all 19 hijackers. There were 5 on board each plane, except Flight 93, which had 4. 4 p.m., media reports indicate that U.S. officials have credible evidence tying the morning's attacks to Saudi militant Osama bin Laden, 1957, 5:20 p.m. Building 7, a 47-story structure, of the World Trade Center complex collapses. Nearby buildings are in flames.
What happened in Grenada?
On October 24, 1983, about 3,000 U.S. Marines and U.S. Army Rangers landed on the Caribbean island. The number included about 300 military personnel from neighboring Antigua, Barbados, Dominica, Jamaica, St. Kitts Nevis, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent. The arrival followed the October 12 through 19 coup in which Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, 1943 to 1983, was overthrown and killed by a hardline Marxist military council headed by General Hudson Austin. While the United Nations and Friends of the United States condemned President Ronald Reagan, 1911 to 2004, for the action, American troops detained General Austin and restored order on the island. Governor-General Sir Paul Scoon, 1935, formed an interim government to prepare for elections. Most of the U.S. military presence was withdrawn by December 1983, with nominal forces remaining on the island through most of 1985. President Reagan justified the tactic by citing that the coup had put in danger American students on the island. But prevailing political conditions on tiny Grenada were more likely to have inspired the show of force. Increasingly stronger ties between Grenada and Cuba had made many American officials nervous. They feared the island would be used as a way station for shipping Soviet and Cuban arms to Central America.
What happened in the Oklahoma City bombing?
The attack took place at 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995, when a truck bomb exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Of the 168 people who were killed, 19 were children. Another 500 people were injured. The blast, which investigators later learned had been caused by a bomb made of more than 2 tons of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, sheared off the front half of the 9-story building and left a crater 8 feet deep and 30 feet wide. Nearby buildings were damaged or destroyed, including a YMCA daycare center where many children were seriously injured. The force of the explosion shattered windows blocks away. Survivors of the blast and others in the vicinity began rescue efforts right away. Eventually more than 3,600 people from around the country participated in rescue operations, including police, firefighters, and members of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Police and Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, agents arrested members of an American right-wing militant group who were suspected of wanting to avenge the April 19, 1993, FBI/ATF raid on the Branch Davidian religious compound in Waco, Texas. Former Army buddies Timothy J. McVeigh, then 27, and Terry L. Nichols, then 40, were indicted on August 10, 1995, on 11 charges each. The two were tried separately and convicted in federal court. McVeigh was found guilty of murder and conspiracy in June 1997, and a federal jury sentenced him to death. Nichols was later found guilty of conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter. But in January 1998 the jury deadlocked on the sentence, which was then to be decided by the judge. In early June it was decided that Nichols would serve life in prison. Officials believe the Murrah Federal Building was targeted in the anti-government attack because it housed 15 federal agencies, including offices of the Social Security Administration, SSA, Housing and Urban Development, HUD, the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, as well as several Defense Department offices and a government-run daycare center.
What is the incidence of conflict in Africa?
Since the end of World War II, 1939–45, there have been at least 56 separate identifiable conflicts in Africa, with about a dozen of them ongoing in 2005. The continent seemed to be in a state of turmoil, with conflicts ranging from regional skirmishes between warlords to civil war. The unimaginable horrors of the Rwandan genocide, 1994, the decades-old civil unrest and ethnic cleansing in Sudan, and long-standing rebel violence in Uganda made news the world over. The war-ravaged image of Africa caused many observers to wonder if the continent was unusually prone to civil war. In a study published by the World Bank, researchers concluded in 2000 that Africa has had a similar incidence of civil conflict to that of other developing regions, and that, with minor exceptions, its conflicts are consistent with the global pattern. The authors of that report acknowledged that the rising trend of conflict in Africa was due to its atypically poor economic performance. While many could see only Africa as war-torn, others pointed to the fact that most of Africa's nations were peaceful, and that the trouble spots gave the international community an overstated impression of despair on the continent.
Which countries comprised the Allies in World War II?
The three major Allied powers were Great Britain, the United States, and Soviet Union. Their leaders, Winston Churchill, 1874–1965, Franklin Roosevelt, 1880–1945, and Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953, were referred to as the Big Three. They and their military advisors developed the strategy to defeat the Axis countries, though Stalin, for the most part, acted alone on the Soviet front. China, which had been at war with Asian rival Japan since 1937, also joined the Allies. 46 other countries became part of the Allied front before the war was over. Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. And within days Great Britain entered into fighting against Germany. Australia, New Zealand, India, France, South Africa, and Canada also allied with Great Britain, as did Norway. Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg in 1940, all of them under siege by Nazi Germany. Greece entered the war later that year, as did Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941. On June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union entered the war. And in the days after the Japanese bombing of the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941, 12 more Allied countries became involved in the war, chief among them, the United States and China. The others, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, were all Caribbean and Latin American countries. Panama, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, Cuba, and Guatemala. The year 1942 saw 3 more countries join the Allies: Mexico in May, Brazil in August, and Ethiopia in December. In 1943 and 1944, in what were perhaps the darkest days of the war, Iraq, Bolivia, Iran, and Colombia signed on as allied nations, followed by the tiny country of San Marino. Significant since it is situated wholly within the boundaries of Axis power Italy, Colombia, and Liberia. February and March of 1945 saw another wave of nations siding with the Allies. The South American countries of Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, Chile, Venezuela, Uruguay, and Argentina, along with the Middle Eastern countries of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia. Mongolia, the Mongolian People's Republic, in Central Asia, was the last to join the Allies. On August 9, 1945. Of course, the level of support each Allied nation lent to the war effort varied. But it was significant that the list of Allied nations grew longer with each year that the war was fought.
What was Camp David 2?
In July 2000, President Bill Clinton, 1946, invited Israeli and Palestinian Authority leaders to the presidential retreat at Camp David, Maryland, to hammer out a final peace agreement in the Middle East. In what could have been the major breakthrough in the conflict, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, 1942, agreed to a Palestinian state, including the West Bank and East Jerusalem. and the administration of all Jerusalem holy sites by a third party, i.e. neither Israel nor Palestine. In exchange, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, 1929 to 2004, was asked to sign an end of conflict addendum to the final agreement, which would have required him to bring the militant Arab group Hamas under control and end all Palestinian attacks on Israelis. But Arafat refused the deal. The July 11 to 25 meeting ended without an agreement. Violence erupted again in Israel, beginning the Second Intifada.
Is the bombing of buildings a new phenomenon?
Though terrorist bombings seem a plague of recent decades, the history of such strikes goes back to a time before the word terrorism was part of everyday language. In 1920, a bomb explosion on September 16 ripped through the J.P. Morgan Bank building in New York City, killing 39 people, 30 of them instantly, injuring 300 more, and causing $2 million in property damage. According to eyewitness accounts, the bomb had been carried by a horse-drawn carriage into the heart of America's financial center just before midday, and it exploded as nearby church bells tolled noon. Among the victims were passers-by in the street and people working at their desks, including some high-ranking personnel at J.P. Morgan. Suspicion centered around anarchists, some of whom were questioned by the police and Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. But no culprit was ever found. Until September 11, 2001, that event was the deadliest bombing in New York City history. Further, the many bombings carried out by white supremacists during the civil rights movement in the 1960s are also testimony to the fact that targeted bombings are not a new phenomenon. Between 1962 and 1965, as the Council of Federated Organizations worked to register voters in Mississippi, racial extremists turned to violence. Among the tactics used in addition to shootings, beatings, and lynches were bombings. During Freedom Summer, 1964, alone, more than 65 homes, churches, and other buildings were bombed in Mississippi. Perhaps the most widely publicized of those bombings was the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, on September 15. 1963, 200 people were attending Sunday services when a bomb exploded. 4 young African American girls were killed. But the sorrow of that day did not stop there. The bombing provoked racial riots, and police used dogs to control the crowds. 2 black schoolboys were killed in the melee.